The time of Mendeleev, gallium was not known. It is one of those question marks. Aluminium, of course, was known very well. Mendeleev put this question mark because he wanted something in the same row as aluminium. Aluminium 27, question mark equals 68. There was no element known between zinc and arsenic in those days. Lothar Meyer would have taken arsenic and put it up here because that was the next one after zinc. And that's when he would have landed in a mess because the properties of arsenic are nothing like the properties of aluminium. Arsenic is more like phosphorus. So Mendeleev put it there. That's why he was able to put arsenic very confidently next to phosphorus. He said what Mendeleev said, which would not have been a scientific thing using Western thinking, he said there must be some element that is not known to us that is very much like aluminium and has an atomic weight of 68. This he called Eka aluminium. Mendeleev, by the way, was a great fan of Sanskrit. He belonged to a group of North Europeans who were very fascinated with Sanskrit in the middle 19th century. So that's why he said there is an element like aluminium, which I am going to call Eka aluminium. He even gave it a symbol EA. He said its atomic weight will be about 68. Remember, he said question mark equals 68. He went further. He said the density will be this much. The melting point will be low, he says. The valency would be 3, he says. He talked about the oxide. He talked about the density of the oxide. It's almost like he knew about this whole thing without knowing without it being ever found. He knew everything about gallium before anybody found gallium. Now, when he made this prediction, when he announced his periodic table, when he announced the periodic table and said there must be something like this, immediately the Western scientists, the Germans and all of that time, they reacted in horror. They said, what's going on? What is this guy talking? Without data, he is proposing a theory. A few years later, a chemist called Lecoq in France actually discovered gallium. And these are the final properties of gallium, which, as you can see, are very close to what Mendeleev had predicted earlier. The prediction came before the experiment. Very important. Now, there's a funny story in the discovery of gallium. When Lecoq first isolated gallium, he had an impure sample. He didn't know the sample was impure, and the density was lower than 5.9. So he wrote to Mendeleev and said, "Dear Professor Mendeleev, I think I have found Eka aluminium. Everything about it is like you said, but the density is somewhat lower than what you said." And within days, he gets a reply from Mendeleev saying, "Dear Mr. Lecoq, your experiment is wrong. You please go and do the experiment again. Yours sincerely, Mendeleev." Now imagine somebody saying something like this. Somebody reports an experiment and then you tell him your experiment is wrong. So sure was Mendeleev of his theory that he said the experiment must be wrong because he knew his theory was right. See, this is again like opposite. They ended with ether, we started with ether. Same thing. This man is starting with a certain feeling about the periodic table. He knows that periodic table of his is correct. So he says any experimental fact that doesn't fit into this periodic table, that experiment itself has to be wrong. You see, again, this reverse thinking. This Königsberg, all these kings going away and the place being destroyed, and Kashi with that super king, Vishwanath, sitting there going on forever. You see, opposite. There is no meeting. Kipling said east is east and west is west. Never was a truer word said. The whole question which I am now going to come to is that Mendeleev was more part of the east than to the west. That is what I'm coming to. This is the point I'm trying to make. When he said that your experiment is wrong, then that fellow went and did the experiment, and Mendeleev was right. Then he came back and said, sorry, my experiment was India, I was having an impure sample, and this is the density of gallium which fits in with your prediction perfectly. The end of the story. So it was not just gallium and Eka aluminum. Many predictions he made like this, which have all turned out to be correct. Gallium, scandium, germanium, technetium, none of these things were known at the time of Mendeleev. In fact, he became so ambitious that he even went to 3 and all that. Because in the subsequent rows of the periodic table, Eka was in the row below aluminium, then in the row below that was 3 and the row below that was 3. So he was quite confident. All these elements, by the way, have been found. And they all seem to have the properties. Rhenium looks like manganese. Polonium has properties like tellurium. No problem. So the gentleman was completely correct. The full list of Mendeleev's prediction with their Sanskrit names as given by Mendeleev. And this is what we are now coming to. How did Mendeleev get this picture? It is using something called intuitive knowledge. There are two types of knowledge: intellectual knowledge and intuitive knowledge. Intellectual knowledge is what is practiced by the Westerners, the Kantian philosophy of things. You have a lot of data which is obtained very accurately. You take all the data and then you take that information and develop it into knowledge using an analysis of that data. Now, intuitive knowledge that Mendeleev used is totally different. Now, look at this picture on the right-hand side, this colored picture. You look at it. The proof of Pythagoras theorem comes out immediately. You don't have to do all those complicated proofs, drawing those dotted lines or going to similar triangles and all those things we learned in school. Here is the proof of Pythagoras theorem, which comes from Vedic mathematics. It just says in the treatise, it says, see and behold, that's all. You see it and then the result is there. It is certainty. And one of the finest examples of what intuitive knowledge is all about is written in Radhakrishnan's book, An Idealist View of Life. I think any educated person, if he has not read this book, it's a small book, you should read it. He says the characteristic of intuitive knowledge is certainty rather than communicability, which characterizes intellectual knowledge. Communicability means, I saw this, this is what is there, and therefore I think this is what my result is. So you are able to communicate your thinking to somebody. That is intellectual knowledge. Certainty, which characterizes intuitive knowledge, is what Mendeleev had. He knew his periodic table is correct. He put those question marks because he knew it was correct. So he said, yes, it will be found. Some element would be found. Intuition does not oppose intellect, but rather lies beyond it. This is a very important sentence. Intuition does not oppose intellect. These are not two things against each other. In other words, intuitive knowledge, although it does not contradict the necessity of reason, questions the sufficiency of reason. You have to develop a high degree of perfection in intellectual knowledge before you can dare to use intuitive knowledge. Otherwise, intuitive knowledge just becomes some shabby guesswork. And Mendeleev was not doing guesswork. Today, you can predict a crystal structure through intuitive knowledge. It is not guessing. You're not guessing the result. You can predict the behavior of complex systems with intuitive knowledge. You can predict monsoons with intuitive knowledge. You need to have done a tremendous amount of reading in intellectual knowledge. For example, he wrote that bestseller book in organic chemistry, which was all about intellectual knowledge, before he was able to jump into this higher level of intuitive knowledge. Does not contradict the necessity of reason, but questions the sufficiency of reason. Here is another very important sentence. Intuition is not illogical, but super logical. It is above logic. It is not against logic. And finally, in summary, because you are doing a synthesis here, both intellect and intuition must be synergized in the quest for the nature of ultimate reality. It is not just the periodic table or the monsoon or biological system. It is for the ultimate reality itself. To question why we are, who we are, where we are, you have to use both intellect and intuition. This is what this gentleman was saying in this book, Idealist View of Life. And it communicates pretty well. I think many of our big results in science, DNA, for example, was an example of intuitive knowledge, the double helix. Kekule's discovery of the benzene ring, once again, intuitive knowledge. So great problems, big problems in science have been solved with intuitive knowledge.